So we have been in this series of teachings we're calling Brave Spaces. We've talked about the bravery of changing the trajectory of your life. We've had conversations about violence and money and power. And why would we have conversations like this in church? Because Jesus talks about all these things. And part of our commitment to being a Jesus-centered church is to look at Jesus and the way of Jesus and the ways those things affect our real lives. And so today, we're closing out the series with maybe the most contentious. We're going to talk about politics. We're going to talk about politics today. And I see some of you came here just for today. It's great. I'd be lying if I was to say that I don't have a little bit of nerves about this message. And the reason I feel a little bit of nerves, and it's different than I think being nervous, but I can feel it in my body because politics has been an incredibly contentious space in our culture. And I wish I could say that it was just in the culture and not in the church. But I think we've all seen how this has been a contentious space among Christians and Jesus followers too. And so we very intentionally want to started today with, let's call it the prayers of the people. Just kind of centering our hearts for a minute to recognize that we could have debates about all of these political topics. Over the coming year, politicians will have to give some kind of platform to all of these topics. But wherever you're at on all of these topics, we have to recognize if these affect real people whom Jesus loves. So, if I'm a little more tied to my notes today, that's because I do want to be careful with my words today. So this Bible will stay in my hands this whole sermon. I did want to open up with some opening statements today. First off, I want to say in our church, this church, Westwinds, we have people who vote red, people who vote blue, and people who will not vote because they believe that's what God would have them do. No matter how you vote, you are welcome in our church. We earnestly seek to be a Jesus-centered church, which means if you'd like to be here, Jesus would love to have you. With that, I want to invite you to try to see politics through the lens of Jesus and not Jesus through the lens of your politics. Now today, as I'm talking about politics, I wanted to maybe name some of my own biases, maybe set some expectations off the top in case these are lingering in your brain as I'm sharing today. I am not going to tell you how to vote. I don't believe the church or any church should endorse candidates. I don't believe any political party is more Christ-centered than another. So I guess I also believe that Christians should not hold up their favorite candidate as God's choice. Secondly, I don't believe America to be a Christian nation. However, I do believe that Christianity has had a bit of a home court advantage in the U.S. for quite some time. The founding fathers certainly looked at the Bible for some wisdom. However, looking at the Bible for some wisdom is different than submitting to the way of Jesus we find in the scriptures. Lastly, I'm convicted by what recent political discourse has done, both, hear this, in my own heart and in the hearts of many fellow Christians. Today, I invite you to a way of understanding the role of American politics through the lens of Jesus and biblical history. But I want to be clear, I'm still working through it. And so as I share today, you are free to eat the meat and spit out the bones. Fair enough? Let me pray for us in the way that Jesus taught his disciples to pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever and ever. A few weeks ago, when I was talking about money and wealth and having this brave conversation around Jesus, I shared a story quickly about some people who came to Jesus trying to trap him. Actually, these people were the Pharisees, so some of the leaders in the church, and then some of the followers of Herod, who's the leader or the king of that time that had a Roman occupation in Jerusalem. That passage, and I'll read just some of it here, but the Pharisees met together to find a way to trap Jesus in his words. They sent their disciples along with the supporters of Herod. So just catch the relationship here, right? The supporters of Herod, the rulers who have occupied Jerusalem, who are oppressing the Jews, have gotten together with the Pharisees, the leaders of the church, to trap Jesus. It's incredible how we can unify around political things just because we have a common enemy, isn't it? Teacher, they said, we know that you are genuine and that you teach God's way as it really is. We know that you are not swayed by people's opinions because you don't show favoritism. So tell us what you think. Does the law allow people to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Now, to understand the weight of this question, we actually need to back the story up about 600 years. So about 600 years prior, there was an empire called the Babylonian Empire. And 600 years prior, this Babylonian Empire at 3 different times sent in military into Jerusalem and Judea, where God's people were, to take over, to pillage the land, to burn down houses and destroy the region. And then they also then would exile people to go back to Babylon and serve in the Babylonian Empire. So this is going on. You can read about this in Jeremiah. So the book of Jeremiah was this priest in Judea who in the midst of this time stayed. So Jeremiah was not exiled, but Jeremiah stayed in the ruins of the city and pastored, or was the priest of God's people. The book of Jeremiah is a collection of Jeremiah's teachings, of Jeremiah's kind of musings, and some thoughts he had for God's people, some wisdom for God's people in a time like this. Jeremiah's book opens up with this calling that Jeremiah has from God. These are some of the words from that calling. Then the Lord stretched out his hand, touched my mouth, and said to me, I'm putting my words in your mouth. This very day I appoint you over nations and empires to dig up, to pull down, to destroy and demolish, to build and to plant. Now, if you're a Jew during this time, if you're one of God's people during this time, these words would be really important, right? Like to dig up, to pull down, to destroy, to demolish, to build and to plant. Probably in hearing this calling, Jeremiah, who has no power at the time, is curious about, but when and how? Like, when am I building and planting? When am I demolishing and destroying? I mean, this is the question that weighs in the hearts of God's people in times of oppression. There are some people who think that in this time that we should raise up a military and try to take on Babylon and fight for what is ours. There are others that would prefer to say, you know what, let's just compromise our faith and go along with the Babylonian people. Let's just become Babylonian. And so wrapped into Jeremiah's calling is this calling to address both sides of this conversation. So Jeremiah's book then continues, and for the first 23 chapters of the book of Jeremiah, he primarily addresses 2 challenges. One is that some of God's people are worshiping Babylonian idols of the empire. Now, worshiping idols of the empire would have been like some of their images, their statues, but worshiping these idols would have required really specific sacrifices that would have deeply broke the heart of God. I would read about some of those right now, but they're very graphic. You can open your Bible and read about them yourself sometime. But the second is that God's people are acting like Babylonians. They're forgetting the people who are neglected by the empire. So the behavior of the empire is disproportionately affecting certain kinds of people, and God's people are forgetting those people. So to be clear, Jeremiah's book is addressing primarily two things: people worshiping the idols of the empire and people acting like people of the empire. You can find this very pointed in a sermon in the middle of the book of Jeremiah, in Jeremiah chapter 7, where God calls out God's people through Jeremiah, saying, you worship God in the temple, but outside the temple, you worship the idols of the empire. The idols of the empire that require exploitation of vulnerable people. The next section of the book of Jeremiah, Jeremiah gives some warnings. He's saying, listen, empires will be with us again and again and again. Because some of you may think, let's just keep our head down and this will all go away. But Jeremiah warns the people that this will not be the last empire. There'll be another one, and there'll be another one, and there'll be another one. And then comes Jeremiah chapter 29. In chapter 29, Jeremiah writes a letter to the exiles. So these are the individuals who have been removed from Jerusalem and Judea and brought to Babylon to serve in the Babylonian Empire. And this is what Jeremiah writes in this letter to those individuals. The Lord of heavenly forces, the God of Israel, proclaims to all the exiles I have carried off from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Cultivate gardens and eat what they produce. Get married and have children. Then help your sons find wives and your daughters find husbands, in order that they too may have children. Increase in numbers so that you don't dwindle away. What is Jeremiah telling them? Build a life. Build a practice. Don't stop practicing our Jewish way of life. Don't give up the practices of God that God has given to us because you are in Babylon, but become a city, a people inside of a people, a city inside of a city, a community inside of a community. But then he goes on and he says, promote the welfare of the city where I have sent you to exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because your future depends on its welfare. Can you imagine being in exile and receiving this letter from your pastor? And he says, you know what you need to do? You need to get back to being the people of God. But on top of that, you need to promote the welfare of where you are exiled. You need to promote the welfare of those people who burned your town, those people who removed you from where you live, those people who are forcing you to serve here. Promote their welfare. I don't think this would have been a well-received letter. The questions about, well, do we compromise our faith or destroy the empire? Jeremiah is like, well, what if we did something different than that? What if you built a practice that was compelling, and the overflow of that practice was to literally love your enemies? Verse 8 goes on here. It says, don't let the prophets and diviners in your midst mislead you. Don't pay attention to your dreams. They are prophesying lies to you in my name. I didn't send them, declares the Lord. See, these prophets and diviners, they're buddying up with different groups of people, the different conversations. Some are saying, let's raise up a military and take them out. This is what God is telling us to do. Others are saying, God is just okay with this. Just give up your faith, compromise your faith, go along with the empire, just become what the empire is. And Jeremiah is saying, don't listen to those prophets and diviners. I was going to bring a soapbox with me to set right here so that I could stand on it whenever I was talking from myself rather than the Bible. But I want to maybe give a little bit of a warning as we enter this election season. There will be pastors in this election season that will proclaim that that candidate is chosen by God. There will be candidates who will proclaim that I am the candidate that will serve your religion the best. I want to say all of it is lies, and you should not listen to those. This is what Jeremiah is warning the people. Don't be swayed. by this pulling back and forth and back and forth. Don't get caught up in those who will use religion to promote their own empires. But Jeremiah is calling God's people to live a very specific way in the midst of empire, to not be formed by the empire, but to be formed by the way of God. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox for a minute. Back to the scriptures. Picking up at verse 11. I know the plans I have in mind for you, declares the Lord. They are plans for peace, not disaster, to give you a future filled with hope. When you call me and come and pray to me, I will listen to you. When you search for me, yes, search for me with all of your heart, you will find me. I will be present for you, declares the Lord. I will end your captivity. I will gather you from all of the nations and places where I have scattered you. I will bring you home after your long exile, declares the Lord. It was very common in prophetic tradition to prophesy or give people an imagination about what God's perfect future would look like. And the reason prophets do this is so that people can imagine today what we're trying to build in the future. It's to help us have an imagination to say that if God was king, if Jesus was president, right, this is what the world would look like. So what Jeremiah is doing is saying, listen, there'll be a day that I've created you for that is plans for peace, not disaster. It's a future filled with hope, not despair. So God's people, what you should be working towards is peace, not disaster. God's people, what you ought to be working towards is a future filled with hope, not despair. So the conversations we should be getting caught up in our political season is conversations that bring peace, not disaster. Conversations that are filled with hope and not despair. Now, some of you might be asking, but how? Well, that's what the Old Testament is asking as well, because there's another book of the Bible called the book of Daniel. Daniel exists at this same time. Daniel and his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are written about in this book called Daniel. The four of them were a part of the group of Jews who were exiled to Babylon. And so they're in Babylon. They're part of the group that would have received this letter from Jeremiah. Now, what you need to understand about Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, it didn't take very long in Babylon for the powers and principalities of the time to recognize that they were pretty smart fellas, that they could provide services that were maybe rose above what most of the exiles could provide. And so David and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego actually were invited might be a soft term, to come work in the temple of the Babylonian king. Can you imagine this now? So people probably would have stood back, right? And again, you think about these kind of two groups of people. Oh, good. Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach, they're going to get all the way to the king. They're going to get so close to the king, and they're going to take him out. This is great. Look at the favor. They're going to be able to use this favor and bait and switch that king and take out their leader. And then other people would have been like, hey, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Daniel, like, good for you. Like, take what you can get. They took everything from us. You should just take everything you can get from this Babylonian empire. But if you read the book of Daniel, that's not how these men behave. In fact, there's a story in Daniel chapter 3 where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are kind of caught in a sticky situation. See, the king at this time was King Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar built a giant statue of himself and decreed that everyone in the land would need to bow down to King Nebuchadnezzar's statue and declared Nebuchadnezzar the most high God. See, Nebuchadnezzar considered himself to be divine, to be above the gods. And when it came to this moment, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they refused to bow down. And so King Nebuchadnezzar throws them into a fiery furnace to kill them, except they don't die. And there's this moment where Nebuchadnezzar, that God works this miracle, and this moment where Nebuchadnezzar comes down to the furnace and he sees the three of them in the furnace, still living. And this is what he says. He says, look, I see four men unbound walking around inside the fire, and they aren't hurt. And the fourth one looks like one of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar went near the opening of the furnace of the flaming fire and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, check this out, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. I mean, can you imagine living your life in such a way that the most powerful people of your enemies, the most powerful people of your enemies could look at your life and see God so much in your life that they might say, your God is the Most High God. Nebuchadnezzar declares, may the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be praised. He sent his messenger to rescue his servants who trusted him. They ignored the king's order, sacrificing their bodies because they wouldn't serve or worship any god but their God. Now, this is where you get to see Nebuchadnezzar in full form. I now issue a decree in every people, nation, and language. Whoever speaks disrespectfully about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, let's see here, will be torn limb from limb, and their house will be made a trash heap, because there is no God who can rescue like this. Then the king made Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego prosperous in the province of Babylon. Now, before we think that Nebuchadnezzar had this big salvation moment, it's interesting that Nebuchadnezzar seemingly still doesn't quite get it. This God who acts non-violently to rescue his people from the fiery flames. Nebuchadnezzar then turns around in what I think he thinks is a way to honor that God. The text is supposed to kind of give you a bit of a jarring. Like Nebuchadnezzar, he still doesn't quite get it, does he? The book of Daniel goes on. Nebuchadnezzar, his season as king ends rather abruptly. Belshazzar, his son, takes over as king. Belshazzar really likes Daniel, makes Daniel third in command in the entire temple. Belshazzar then dies rather abruptly. And then in Daniel chapter 6, there's a new king named Darius. And King Darius also likes Daniel, but he likes Daniel in such a way that other people are getting jealous. And so other leaders in the temple conspire together to try and trap Daniel inside of the law. Remember the passage from Matthew, as people got together to try to conspire to trap Jesus in a question about the law. And so they convinced the king, King Darius, to make a decree, a law, that nobody is allowed to pray to any other god except King Darius. So in Daniel chapter 6, this is what it says. When Daniel learned that the document had been signed, I love this, he went to his house. Now in his upper room, he had open windows that faced Jerusalem. Daniel knelt down, prayed, and praised God 3 times that day. And these words are really important, just like he always did. I mean, this is incredible, right? I mean, maybe you're not seeing it yet. There's this decree and this law, and when Daniel reads the law, the second he gets the law, he goes on with his practice the same way he always does. He went up to his room, he bowed on his knees, faced Jerusalem, and prayed one of his prayers that he prayed 3 times every day. Why is Daniel an example here? Daniel is an example because he lives in the way of Jeremiah. He's seeking the well-being of the place while maintaining a practice that keeps him from being formed by that empire. Daniel is able to encounter these moments with differentiation because he has a practice in the way of God that has kept him from becoming like the people of the empire. Unlike the people of the land, Daniel would not worship gods of the empire, and he would not allow that empire to form him in the way of the empire. Daniel chapter 6:16, Daniel, the King Darius here gets trapped, and he now has to punish Daniel, but he really likes Daniel. So if you read this in Daniel chapter 6, you can hear the grief on Darius's heart, like he feels kind of trapped by his own law in this moment. So the king gives order, and they brought Daniel and hurled him into a pit of lions. And the king said to Daniel, get this, your God, the one you serve so consistently, will rescue you. Daniel lived his life among the people of the empire in such a way that the most powerful people of the empire began to have faith in the power of Daniel's God. So you might be asking, but how? Well, I think this is what Jesus is leading us to. But how? See, Jesus enters the scene under another empire, the Roman Empire. At the time of Jesus, the Roman Empire had occupied Jerusalem, just like Jeremiah had predicted, right? There'll be more empires and more empires and more empires. And in Jesus' time, so much of Jesus' teachings fall on the same backdrop as the book of Jeremiah. There are people who are worshiping the idols of the empire, except the Roman idols were not statues of kings or statues of gods. The Roman Empire idols were things like judgment and hatred and wealth and control and violence and power. And God's people were neglecting the people most affected by the judgment of the empire and the hatred of the empire and the wealth of the empire and the control of the empire and the violence of the empire and the power of the empire. See, empire had become not only the politic of the time, but it also was finding its way into the hearts of the people. And so much of Jesus' teachings and way speak to and stand in contrast to the empire and how it's invaded the hearts of people. The story with the Pharisees and the followers of Herod picks up in chapter 22, verse 18 of Matthew. It said, knowing their evil motives, Jesus replied, why do you test me, you hypocrites? Show me the coin you used to pay the tax. And they brought him a denarian. It was a currency of the Roman Empire in Jerusalem. They brought him a denarian. Whose image and inscription is on this, he asked. Caesar's, they replied, the leader of the empire. Then they said, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God. When they heard this, they were astonished, and they departed. I mean, what is Jesus saying in the way of Jesus, or the way of Jeremiah, and the way of Daniel? Give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Give to the empire what is the empire. But don't let that form you. Give to God what is God. What is God's in the way of Jesus? It's the people. It's the people. It's the actual human beings that bear the image of God. And too often in our political discourse, we can't just let Caesar have what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. Too often we forget about the actual human beings on the other side of these policies. These are God's people. These are the people that God has created in God's divine image. And we want to fight with each other about the things of the empire. About the things that the political realm tells us we should worry about, what they tell us we should be feared of, what they tell us we should value. But God invites us to have a practice where our hearts are so deeply formed in the way of Jesus that we can't miss in times of political debate, in times of political upheaval, we can't miss the people that God's heart is so deeply broken over. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Give to God what is God. In Jeremiah's book, he goes on after this letter and says, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like a covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, another empire, right? So Jeremiah is saying, remember how I led our people out of the empire of Egypt once before. And for those people, I made a covenant. He's talking about the 10 Commandments. I made a covenant with them. I gave them a law. I wrote it down on stones. But my covenant they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. For this covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them. I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. So here's the reflection point here. Which law do you find is written on your heart? Is it the law of God? Are we formed in such a way that we have Jesus' law deeply written on our hearts? Or are we formed in such a way that the laws of the empire are more deeply written upon our hearts? See, friends, it's not about voting red or blue or abstaining. It's not about whether or not you're getting caught up in the way of empire. It's whether or not you're getting caught up in the way of God. It's not about whether our primary focus needs to be on Caesar. Our primary focus needs to be on God and what God is doing. We must recognize, friends, the power of the empire to form us. And so we must have practices that counterform us in the way of Jesus. It was about a few years ago, I was sitting with a friend who would not call themselves a Christian. They actually are a pretty devout they practice a different world religion. And I was sitting with them and just enjoying time together, and my friend began to get pretty worked up about a certain political candidate. Really angry, actually, and ranted for like 40 minutes. There was wine involved. But at the end of the rant, he set down his glass of wine and he said, I actually have a picture of that candidate in my office. And every day I get on my knees and I pray for that candidate. I pray that God would bless them and be with them. And I can tell you immediate conviction in my own life. Because I actually, the Jesus that I read about literally tells me to pray for my enemies. Invites me to seek God's kingdom for all. That invites me to practice confession when I fall into hate. Invites me to create a home within the empire that does not play by the same rules as the empire. See, Jesus has this imagination for a community where diversity prays together, eats together, shows up for each other, is generous together, and learns from Jesus together. But empires require enemies. Empires require slaves. Empires require war. Empires require human sacrifice. And my friends, we live in an empire of our time. I mean, someday someone will write a history book about the American empire. We live in an empire of our time, and this empire is no different. It requires enemies and slaves and war and sacrifice. And so we must guard our hearts from being formed in the way of empire. The book of Jeremiah ends with a bit of a warning. I'm going to invite the band to come up here as I'm sharing the end here. The book of Jeremiah ends with this warning. It warns God's people and says, empire will judge you. Again, tough words from Jeremiah, under the hand of the empire. And Jeremiah, this pastor, priest, is saying, listen, the empire will judge you. And then he says, but God will judge the empire. So understand what's happening here. The empire will judge you, but God will judge the empire. I think what he's saying is like the ways of the empire will be the great revealer of your heart. The way the empire works will judge your heart, that you can contemplate and deeply contemplate, how am I being formed by empire? That empire will judge you. And then it's God's job then to judge that empire. Friends, politics, American politics will judge you. And it's God's job to then judge American politics. I wonder how our political sphere, our political discourse, the empire of our time, has formed each of us in our own hearts. And as we enter this season, I wanted to get ahead of it. As we move through this season, man, I think there'll be a lot of opportunities for confession, to check in with, do I hate? To pray for our enemies. There'll be moments after moment after moment where the empire will judge us. It'll judge our hearts, and we'll be able to return to the way of Jesus and trust in Jesus then to judge the empire. We're going to finish our gathering in some unity. Back to where we started, we have people in this room who vote red. We have people in this room who vote blue. We have people in this room who abstain because I think that's what God would have them do. But we are the people of God. Those things will pay to Caesar what is Caesar's. and give to God what is God. And so we'll finish the day singing together. And as we sing together, I want to encourage you to hear these voices around you in that light. And then in a few moments, I'm going to come back and I'm going to lead us to take communion together, this practice that Jesus gave us. With the original community has all these people around it who all think different things about how Jesus should engage in empire. And then he says, this is my body, this is my blood, this is what unifies us. It's me. So I want to encourage you to sing. In a few minutes, I'll come and lead us to the table and finish our practice today, reminded that Jesus invites us to himself with all different kinds of people in all different kinds of ways.